Well, I really enjoyed reading this paper, Alyssa. This has all the elements of a great paper, and I could most envision it landing in international organization. I'm not sure where you're thinking about sending it. Maybe that's something that you could talk to us about. But when I read it, I thought this definitely reads like an IO paper, and were I a reviewer on it, I would recommend it with barely, with not many revisions. So I think it presents a novel theory. The data is novel, well executed, well written. It starts with a puzzle and it makes clear its contributions. So you've done a really nice job with this work. I'm just going to point to a couple of overall comments I have, and they're largely a matter of personal preference. So I'll be curious to hear what the other discussants have to say. The first question I had was, what is the relative importance of leader culpability versus other factors that we've thought of as traditionally driving war outcomes? So how does leader culpability weigh against some of these other factors? And what made me think of this was your paper begins with that neat puzzle in Angola, which wonders why the negotiated settlement in Angola failed when it had all of the makings of success. And it speculates that the reason it failed, even though there were provisions in that settlement that should have led to success, but it did fail because the leader was culpable, and that once the culpable leader, you imply that the culpable leader was replaced with a non-culpable or non-responsible leader, but that was able to end the conflict. And it left me wondering if leader culpability is most responsible for the success of negotiated settlements than other provisions, such as what we've traditionally thought of as power sharing and third-party guarantees. Mm-hmm. I realize that you're not actually looking at negotiated settlements as an outcome, but I think if the paper is going to convincingly improve the literature, that you may need to address that. And I guess I think you may need to address the overall question of, is leader culpability the most important factor in what drives civil war outcomes, whether it be outright victories or negotiated settlements. And to that end, you started with the puzzle, and you return to the puzzle in the conclusion, but don't really fully answer the puzzle. You mentioned that Savimbi was unflappable, but then you don't tell us if Gatto was flappable, and therefore that was what led to the conflict ending. So if you could wrap up the puzzle in the conclusion, I think this would be a nice way to end it. Okay. So the second main concern is that the paper, well, so I like that the paper never mentions the word selectorate. I thought that was fine. And I like that you've got this simple assumption, which is that there's some constituency that prefers a competent leader who best represents the interests of that constituency. But I had a hard time imagining or conceiving that competence is judged in exactly the same way for a rebel leader as it is a state leader. And your sole measure of competence for both is that do they obtain victory in a war. And for rebel leaders, this makes sense to me. I can imagine that that's the single dimension that rebel leaders are evaluated on. But for state leaders, I would imagine that they're judged on a number of other dimensions. And what I think this would mean would be that those state leaders would be less culpable for war outcomes and therefore less risk-seeking, less likely to seek those extreme outcomes. And so I guess what I'm wondering is, overall, can you speak to if the results are mainly driven by rebel leaders, or is it fairly consistent across both types?
Okay.
The third comment refers to mostly the organization of the paper. And to me, the main contribution of your paper is that you've changed how we think about civil war outcomes. You've gone beyond this negotiated settlement victory dichotomy to something else. And that's a really neat contribution. But I think it gets a little bit lost because of how the paper wraps up, which is these analyses of leader fate, leader ultimately what happens to the leaders. And I get why you did that, because that's sort of what happens chronologically in time. But I think the narrative of the paper would be a lot smoother if you shifted the organization a bit, so that you started with a discussion of the effect of war outcomes on leader fate, and actually analyzed, or you presented your analyses right after that discussion. So right now you have this discussion of the effect of culpability on leader fate, and it ends, the section ends, I think, like around page 14. And so if you started there, just jumped into your analyses there, and then moved into the analyses of the effect of culpability on extreme civil war outcomes. To me, that would just be, because I think that the argument that leaders' fate is determined by their culpability makes sense. I don't think it's all that controversial. I think it's a strong foundation for your theory. You've got the added benefit that you actually tested it. But I don't think it's the main contribution, and where it's placed in the paper right now, it sort of wraps up as if it is the main contribution. Okay. A fourth thought is, I wonder if you, and I hesitate to make this suggestion because I don't think the paper needs to be any longer, but if you were to think about looking into a case that doesn't seem to fit with your theory, so some sort of case where there's a culpable leader that actually negotiates or makes concessions. And if in that case there was some sort of face-saving effort to make the leaders seem less culpable and therefore make them more likely to negotiate, whether that be the international community impose some sort of face-saving effort or the leader made an effort to save face somehow. That would be kind of a cool way to bolster your theory, even in cases that don't seem to fit your theory. Fifth main thought is that you don't cite your own work, and you need to. So you need to cite your stuff with Paul and your dissertation and anything else that you've written that's in a reasonable place to cite. But overall, I think this is a great piece. I think there's so many cool extensions of this work that I'm sure you've thought about and that you're considering, that you're working on. I thought about, what would be the effect of leader culpability on all kinds of risky civil war strategies, such as killing civilians. And how might the international community mitigate the effect of that culpability, which you speculate about in the conclusion. I think that's fascinating, and I can see a number of ways that we might see that. And then you also mentioned, how does culpability lead to seemingly unrelated civil war outcomes or unexpected civil war outcomes, such as decapitation of leaders? So lots of cool places you can take this, and really enjoyed reading it. So thank you.
Thank you.
Alyssa, and then we'll open it up. And if you want to get on the queue, then show me a finger, and I mean just that one, or clarify. If you want to make an intervention, that's 2 fingers. Please, Alyssa, respond.
Okay. Thanks for the comments. Some of these things I've thought about, and some of them I haven't yet. So that's, I think, a good thing to get new perspectives. The comment about our state and rebel leaders going to be judged similarly. I've gotten that comment before in a few different ways, and I've thought about it. So I've thought about it a little bit. So just for a little bit of background, this is a paper that came out of my dissertation, and so in the dissertation I have some robustness checks to address that, at least empirically. So I do look at sort of rebel and state leaders separately to see if the effects on war outcomes are the same, if the size of the effect and significance and all of that. For war outcomes, they do both seem to have fairly comparable results. So both state and rebel leaders who are culpable are going to be more likely to have extreme war outcomes, or less likely to make concessions. another test that is not in this paper but is in the dissertation and is in theory going to be in a separate paper is looking specifically at duration rather than outcome. And the results there are a little less robust across the two different sets of leaders. So the results are very strong for rebel leaders, whereas for state leaders, they're not quite as robust. So I've started thinking about why that might be the case. When I look at the likelihood of punishment for those two separate groups, so for state leaders versus rebel leaders are punished more than state leaders are, and I think that makes sense. I think it makes sense that state leaders are a little bit more sort of insulated against removal, particularly by the opponent, but also in some cases by their internal audience. So I think I could address that better in this actual paper, and attack it on theoretical grounds as well. Let's see, organization of the paper. That's a good idea. So I think if I understood what you were saying, you were essentially saying flip the empirical analyses so that the outcome results come last and the leader punishment results come first. I could certainly do that. I hadn't thought of doing it as sort of like the way I was thinking about it was, let me test the main implications of the theory and then let me test the mechanism underlying it. So I hadn't really thought about doing it the other way. I'd be curious to hear what other people think about that. In terms of a case that doesn't fit the theory, that might still involve some sort of face-saving efforts, I can't think of one immediately off the top of my head, but I know that there are some in the data, and I can certainly go look through and see, what fits that. Because I do remember as I was sort of collecting all of this data that there were instances where that seemed to be going on. And let's see. Looking at sort of the relative importance of culpability versus other factors. That is something that I hadn't really thought about. I mean, I think, so in my dissertation, one of the chapters is a case study of the Angola conflict. And so in that chapter, I sort of discuss other factors that were at play sort of at the end of the war in particular, and discuss how leader culpability really does seem to be more important than a lot of those factors. So there was resource extraction going on. I'm blanking on some of the other stuff, but so I can certainly discuss that more if I can find some space in this paper to do that. Yeah, I guess I'll stop there.
Will at a two-finger, and then Q's open.
I've got a one on as well, Chris. So I just wanted to follow up, Alyssa, on the suggestion of considering the reordering. And I thought it was very interesting that you said you ordered it, that you wanted to test the main implication and then follow up by testing the mechanism.
Uh-huh.
That's in your head, not in the paper. And I think
okay.
I think that for me helped structure it. That may, if you just make that explicit, I think it may. It's one way to think about trying to address the issue that Meg raised.
Okay.
Alex, and then.
So I have a variety of different comments. I'd just say up front I enjoyed reading the paper. I'll not put all my comments in right now, but maybe come back at a certain point. I was interested, following on Megan's comments, in the competence logic here, because it struck me, I was trying to think about how this would work in practical cases. We have a model where the leader knows their own competence better than the public. And I think about, like, say for me, the analogy would be that I know my competence as a political scientist better than the University of Pennsylvania does. I'm not sure that's actually true. I mean, I learn things about my own competence every time I send something out for review and get responses. And what struck me as a potentially stronger place where there would be private information that the leader would know would be more sort of faithfulness to the goals of the group. So some leaders are relatively corrupt, some of them are relatively true believers, and you have this sort of aside about true believers at some point. I think that could get incorporated in a little bit more easily here, where leaders who are primarily in it for themselves have to pretend to be true believers, and they're, but they're going to be willing at critical junctures to trade off benefits for the group in exchange for benefits for themselves, and that's going to have impacts on the success of the military effort and a variety of other things like that. What kind of settlement, what kind of outcome you get at the end of the day. So I think that to me struck me as a more plausible story to tell about what's the nature of the principal agent problem that's underlying this dynamic, and it also gets around some of the problems. It's hard for me to ascribe too much significance in terms of military outcome to the leader's own competence, because there's so many other factors that play into that, as you note in the paper. So that was one suggestion for. I think it wouldn't be a huge tweak, but it would get around some of the objections that I at least would have had.
Okay.
And I'll let it go there. I have a bunch of other comments. But.
Just to check, Caroline, did I see your hand go up?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Jessica?
Well, hold on. Does Alyssa want to respond?
Oh, sorry. Where'd you go? Oh, yeah.
I can just say quickly, I sort of recognize that there's a tension. Like I talk about competence and faithfulness, and I sort of talk about competence more, but that was actually a point that I'm glad you picked up on, because there's some tension in the paper, and I'm not entirely I wasn't entirely sure which sort of way I wanted to go with the theory. So yeah, so that's useful to have feedback on.
Ideen, was that a 1 or a 2?
Oh, I didn't have a hand up. Sorry for joining late. The link just came through for me, but continue.
No problem. Jessica dropped out, so we'll wait for her to come back. But Will, go ahead. Oh, hold it. We have a 2-finger.
Michelle?
Michelle?
Yeah. Well, this is, I don't know if this is technically 2, but it's because it's coming back to a point that Megan made in her comments earlier. But I just wanted to reiterate, I also struggled, I study state behavior, so this was a little bit different for me to think about. But I struggled with seeing the applicability of the theory as it worked for rebel groups differently from state leaders. I kept coming back to this idea that, wow, this really seems like a great paper on rebel group leaders and how their incentives structure their decisions. So I thought, and Megan had made the comment about adding maybe a mini case study, but maybe that would make the paper too long. Actually, maybe a nice halfway point in your theory section, you might consider a couple of illustrative examples, not a full-out case study, but a couple of illustrative examples to demonstrate, particularly if you could show one where state leaders' incentives are deciding, whether they're negotiating or things like that. I think I would get on board much quicker.
Okay. And
then I would, you'd sort of allay that concern, and I could kind of consume the rest of the paper with a little bit more ease, because that was just a nagging comment I had in the back of my head through the entire read, was just how different is this for state leaders versus rebel leaders. But then again, just to reiterate Megan's point, another way to address that is cite your own work, cite your previous, when you mentioned that chapter in the dissertation that shows that for some of these outcomes, there is not a significant difference between whether it's rebel groups or state groups. I think if you make that point, just state it and cite your work. That way people who are interested or doubtful can just go and see your previous.
Okay.
I added 2, and then Megan. My 2 kind of references this issue of I like that you had both institutions in there.
Can't hear.
I can't hear Christian either.
Yeah, I'm wondering who's giving the feedback. Okay. You hear me now?
It seemed to start when Jess came back in. Jess, could you mute your mic?
Yeah.
Should be at the top.
Okay.
Top middle, there's some thing will pop up.
How about now?
Better.
Yep,
Yeah.
that was it.
So my I
Jess,
like
if
that you
put
had.
in headphones, it might help.
I like that you had security force institutions on both sides. I like that you considered the accountability of both of those actors, and thought through the comparison. Differing from Megan, I kind of was like, I'm like, okay, well, how is this different from selectorate theory? How is this different from, you kind of slide principal agent stuff in later, right? So I'm kind of, up front, I would have liked, okay, I'm looking at elite, and elite agent kind of relationships, and this is different from elite constituency dynamics that you get in selected theory, and this is different from principal agent arguments that you see there. This is how we might think about accountability in these two different institutions, and I think that integrating that earlier and differentiating them would have helped me a great deal, especially because a lot of the standard principal agent stuff doesn't consider some of the elite stuff, right? But if you're looking at the veto players literature, for example, they talk about kind of like those kind of like lateral and horizontal kind of accountability mechanisms, which I thought would have been helpful for getting a sense of what was going on. Megan?
I had a two-finger on Michelle's comments, which was that I think you give this overall figure for how rebel and state leader punishment is, like the percentage of leaders that are punished, but you might consider a figure or a table where you give each type of punishment.
Okay.
Or maybe some sort of picture of an overlapping distribution of punishment. I mean, I guess I imagine that the variance on leader punishment is probably a bit greater than rebel, perhaps. Maybe just some sort of visual to demonstrate the similar frequencies of punishment.
I need another two. We have a series of. Sorry, Alyssa, go ahead.
I just want to clarify. So, do you mean punishment for rebels versus state leaders, or do you mean different types of punishments?
Yeah, I meant different types of punishments across both. So, are they similarly exiled? Similarly.
Okay, got it.
Assassinated. Yeah. Ideen?
Yeah, I mean, I think you mentioned earlier the principal agent theory, and I think it's a nice way to think about rebel groups, but most of the literature actually has that relationship reversed.
Yeah.
Which the leader is the principal and the commanders are the agents. I mean, it sort of was a little bit of a stretch for me anyway, thinking about the leader of the rebel organization doing the bidding of the rank and file or even the top commanders. You know, you think of these as hierarchical organizations where the leader is at top, and if there's dissent within the ranks, that is more like a mutiny or an internal coup than, say, reining in an agent for bad behavior. Now, I don't think you need that theoretical hook in order to make the case. You need to motivate your followers to do things, and that your followers can turn on you and punish you for a variety of reasons, without linking that necessarily to principal agent theory.
Okay.
The other thing that I think that you can be stronger about here is that the degree of control that leaders have over their rank and file members is a variable. It's not something that's constant. I mean, we can think.
Interesting phrase.
Leadership structures.
You might not like that one. We could try to finish the sentence for him.
No, I suspect I think he's on Wi-Fi at home, and it just died on him, is my guess.
Okay. There you go.
There you are.
Well, sorry about that. Sorry. Finish your sentence, dude.
Where did you guys stop here?
the degree of control over rank and file is a variable rather than a constant.
Right, right. I mean, there are some very loose leadership structures in which there's a command council. It's not exactly clear who's in charge. There's a committee versus sort of what we think about with Savimbi or Prabhakaran, which were sort of strong, charismatic leaders. Some groups have very regular turnover.
Yeah.
And is that punishment, or is that just sort of internal dynamics and the way that group chose to organize itself?
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Actually, relate on the kind of my addendum to that is accountability. Maybe is what it is you're talking about, right? Just like how are the people that are out doing the fighting held accountable? How are they? I mean, I'd also want it reversed, right? Agents are accountable too for how the fighting is, right? Hey, I said do this, you did that. I mean, so the accountability goes both ways, but how you're thinking about punishment as opposed to accountability, maybe that wording gets you to a different place. Jessica, you had your hand up and then froze out.
Okay, am I unmuted?
You are unmuted.
Okay, good. So my comment was about the mechanisms about internal punishment versus adversary punishment. And I guess I was trying to think through, as I was reading the paper, I was having trouble with the adversary punishment part of the argument, and I was trying to figure out why. And I think I have some idea about why I was having a little trouble with it. And I think it's because the internal punishment mechanism is about fear of punishment after the war. And the adversary punishment mechanism is about fear of punishment during the war, if I'm understanding your argument correctly. And so I think that clarifying that would really help, because when I was reading through, I think what was causing some confusion for me was that I was thinking initially about adversary punishment as also being something that happens after the war, and the logic of that just doesn't quite fit. So I think clarifying that when the punishment happens is different for those two cases would really help. And then I would say about the adversary punishment piece, I guess I'm not fully convinced that adversary punishment during the war is more likely when the leader
It's 11:30.
is a responsible leader. And I guess this is just because it would seem to me that the opposing side would always want to try to take out the leader of the other side, whether it's the government or the rebel group, if they can. And I wasn't convinced that they would want to take out that leader, kill, capture, whatever the case might be, more if the leader was a responsible leader than if the leader was not a responsible leader. And so I wanted to hear more about to convince me on that.
Okay. So should I respond?
Yes, please.
Okay. I think, so that's an interesting thing that you raised about sort of the timing of adversary versus internal punishment. I actually don't know if I don't think it actually plays out that way, and maybe I've written it that way and I didn't intend to. I think both types of punishment can happen sort of at any time, either during the war or after the war. So I maybe I sort of implied that it was, after the war versus during the war. What I really was implying was sort of after tenure and during their tenure. That could correlate with when the war actually ends, or it could be that a leader loses power and is punished, but the war is still going. So that might just be an issue of clarification within the paper. Regarding sort of the bigger issue, which is whether you believe that adversary punishment is related to responsibility for the war. I mean, I mean, you could probably tell, like, the weaker part of the theory, it's sort of tacked on there. I have tried to figure out ways to make this argument, and I don't know that it's fully successful at this point. I think that it's true, but I think there's probably more noise or more variation, that there are going to be more. There are going to be other reasons that that an adversary would want to punish a particular leader. But I don't think that it's true that they'll want to punish them all the time, right? If you find, if a new leader comes to power of a rebel organization and they don't seem to have sort of these strongly entrenched, like this long-term position in power where you've sort of dealt with them, you know what they're all about, you know that they're going to be sort of unwilling to make compromises, that kind of thing, then I think they would be less likely to want to punish sort of this new, fresh-faced leader that comes in, and they might have an opportunity to bargain with them. So that's sort of where that's the argument that I'm trying to make there. But if it's not convincing, then I'll take suggestions on sort of ways to make it more so.
A series of threes, Alex.
Okay. So I'll just really quickly echo Jess's comment. This was also something that I was a little bit hung up on while reading through it. I mean, at a more general level here, one of the comments that I was going to make, which I think goes a little different from where other people are going, if I understand what you ultimately do with the punishment data in your analysis, it ends up being basically the case that if you lose office, you're punished, and there are other ways in which you could be punished beyond that, but those all get collapsed into a one. And so at the end of the day, it might be the case that punishment is picking up also, like Abdullah Öcalan or somebody who stays in power within the group but is imprisoned, but that it mostly is just, do you hold on to power or not? And if that's the case, it seems like some of the discussion that we're having of some of the levels of nuance on this isn't really getting captured in this paper. It's sort of at the end of the discussion of how you coded and conceptualized punishment, I got to the end of that and I said, well, why did we go through this whole exercise? I understand why you did this in general, but if you're collapsing it down,
right.
That seems like you're introducing a whole lot of stuff that you then don't really need, and especially given other people saying, here are things that I might add. That struck me as one place where you could simplify things, especially because it sort of gives, to some extent, the impression that you did all this stuff, but then you did it one way, and you don't do the more, distinguish among the different forms of punishment as much because maybe it didn't work quite as well or something like that, and you obviously don't want to give that sort of impression.
So I actually have run the punishment equations probably like 30 different ways, and almost everything works. So what I have broken it down by different types of punishment, like sort of severe punishment, so that would be death and imprisonment versus everything else. I've broken it down by leader type, so rebel leaders and state leaders. That works. I've done sort of a, rather than just a dummy variable, I've done an ordered logit type of punishment. So yeah, that's a good point. If I'm going to sort of talk about all of the different types of punishment in the paper, then I should actually present the results for that in the paper.
Or at least mention them.
What?
Or at least mention them, I would say.
Yeah, okay.
ID.
So on this point, both conceptually back to what Jessica was talking about and then with the data in terms of what Alex was talking about. So conceptually and then also in the data set, when you're talking about adversary punishment, is punishment conceptually different than just being killed or captured on the battlefield? And is that something that you distinguish on the data? And then with internal punishment, we can think of leaders being removed because they engaged in bad behavior that the followers didn't like. But then you can also think of the situation in which a leader is deposed internally because of just some internal power struggle, personality differences, not anything sort of bad that you did, but a grab for power within the organization. Are those conceptually distinct for you? And then is there a difference in the data about both of those mechanisms?
So what I tried to do in coding all of this was to limit punishment only to cases where the punishment seemed to occur as a result of the war. I mean, that easier said than done in some cases, but I didn't. If it wasn't clear from the sources that that I used that the punishment was somehow related to the war itself, then I didn't code punishment. So, I mean, this is going to be more likely for it happens more often for state leaders where they lose power, but it's unrelated to the conflict, and so those leaders are not considered punished. In terms of sort of punishment by the adversary versus, is it just being killed or captured on the battlefield? That's not the only type of adversary punishment, but that does get captured in the measure. There's a good example of a leader, I'm forgetting the group, but it's an Iranian group or an Iraqi group that the leader was actually lured to some negotiations in like Germany and then was assassinated by members of the state military. So and there's also instances of exile, and that's sort of a little, that's a little hard to determine, but there are cases where a leader flees the country, and it's fairly clear that they did so because they were worried that if they didn't flee the country, they would be killed or captured. So that gets captured as well. In terms of internal power struggles within either the state or within a rebel organization, again, I tried to limit it to just instances where, if that occurred, the power struggle was sort of induced by the conflict itself. So I don't know if that fully answers your question, but I sort of tried to.
Easy to determine from an empirical standpoint. I mean, we can talk about data and how you validated the data and what sources you used and so on. I think that's an important discussion to have. But leaders fall all the time. There are internal rifts within the organization, and it's sort of hard for me to think about, well, what would I look for if I'm looking for, there's an upstart commander that wants the leadership of this rebel organization and is going to depose you because they're sort of power hungry, versus you did something that the rank and file membership didn't agree with, and then you were overthrown. I'm not sure how that would look different from an empirical standpoint. I mean, how can we tell what the motive of the punisher is? Was it battlefield related, or was it just because I think I could do a better job? I want the good.
Okay. Yeah, I see what you're saying. I mean, it's not an easy thing to determine. So I'm sure that I'm probably not fully sort of separating out those two things. If the sources sort of talked about they agreed to negotiate and the rank and file, and then some other commanders within the organization disagreed with that. That's an example where it was something related, a decision that the leader made related to the conflict, that then sort of led to him being removed or deposed in some way. It's not totally easy to make those distinctions in every case.
Is there a data release paper with this? Have you done one already for this database?
No, not yet.
So the onus on you then, I mean, the papers needs to kind of deal with that type of issue within it, acknowledging that that might also be a broader conversation that you might not be able to take within the context of this paper. I have Caroline and Will on the 2 fingers, but you're both also on the 1 finger, so if you want to consolidate, that's fine. If you want to stick with the 2-finger riff and then go to single, that's cool too.
I'll start with 2 and go to 1.
Okay.
Alyssa, so I think this fits with the theme that you were just on about punishment with respect to leader responsibility. Mm-hmm. And I actually wanted just to push you a little bit further on the leader responsibility issue, which in the paper you defined responsibility as the decision to go to war.
Right.
So as I read that, one of my thoughts was whether it's necessarily this original decision to go to war that always matters most. What I thought about was, what about the conduct of the war itself, particularly if there are high costs associated with that? And this isn't a good example, but it's the only one I could come up with at the moment. And my example is, who's seen as bearing more responsibility or blame for the war in Vietnam? Johnson, who initiated it, or Nixon, who escalated it? So my question is, put another way, is war initiation necessarily the most important form of responsibility, the one that is likely to get a leader assigned greatest amount of blame? And then kind of going along with that, you had some interesting results for your casualties variable in your analysis, which you don't mention at all in the paper. And I'm wondering whether that might be, whether that might bear any relationship to this point I'm bringing up. And the other thing really quickly that I wanted to bring up, this is my one finger, is, and I think, except for Megan initially said something really quickly, we haven't talked at all about the role of third parties in all of this. And I could see a reviewer not letting that go, I mean, in the context of a paper focusing on Civil War. So I just had a couple really quick thoughts here. One was, could third parties help leaders to avoid some forms of punishment? Could third parties themselves act as a source of punishment, like the ICC after civil wars? There's also the possibility that they might help to alter war outcomes by providing certain benefits, like the Camp David Accords. And then you had an interesting result for mediation in your logit analysis, which you also didn't mention at all, and that I thought was interesting in terms of the third-party issue.
Okay. Okay, sorry, running out of paper here. Okay, so leader responsibility, is it only the decision to go to war? So no, probably not, and probably things like, how did they conduct the war? Did they escalate the conflict? Those probably do matter. Those aren't things that I've looked at, but it's a question that did come up the last time I presented this, just last week. So it's something that I sort of started thinking about. I'm building, so the theory builds off of, Sarah Croco's theory of culpability, and so she's focused on the decision to go to war initially, and so that's where I started. So, but I recognize that there are probably other factors that will affect sort of perceptions of responsibility for the conflict. So that's something that I guess I either should address in this paper, or either address it directly, or at least sort of acknowledge that that there are other things that could affect that. In terms of the role of third parties, so I actually have written a paper that have a working paper that looks at the ICC as a source of punishment. It's separate because I just didn't think I could do everything in one paper, but I hadn't thought really, so I have thought about sort of international sources of punishment. What I hadn't really thought about was, and I've also thought about how third parties might affect war outcomes. The thing that you raised that I haven't really thought about is, can third parties help leaders avoid punishment? And that, I think, could potentially be the case. I'm trying to thinking back into the data. I'd have to look and see sort of if and when that happens. My guess is that it probably does at certain times. So as sort of maybe some way of getting at that, I do have information on where the leader is primarily located. Like, are they based abroad, or are they based in the actual country where they're fighting? So that sort of might be a way of getting at that a little bit, in terms of, if another state is willing to host you, then you're going to be less likely to be punished, at least by the adversary. You might still be removed by your internally, but it could diminish the threat of punishment by an opponent. Yeah.
Will. Oh, sorry, were you done?
Yes.
Alyssa, were you done?
Yeah.
Okay, Will.
Okay, I two-finger on Alex's suggestion about less information on the coding of punishment since it's ultimately binary. And I think, I assume you do discuss it in some detail in your dissertation, which is hopefully electronically available. And so what I would encourage you to do, I think that's a great suggestion by Alex, because I also, although I didn't quite nail it down as nicely as he did, I was a little distracted by that and wondering why did I just read that. And then, you know, after, just provide the reader what we need to know about how you measured that for this particular analysis. Have a footnote, letting the reader know in the footnote that in a broader project of which this is a part, there's additional measurement detail broken down into more fine-grained categories, as well as a host of analyses that find the same sorts of results reported here, kind of thing. So just a very explicit way to try to respond to Alex's suggestion.
Thank you. I appreciate explicit suggestions for ways to fix things. So yeah, I agree. That's a good way to go.
I had a quick two-finger, and then Michelle. Mine concerned, you're assuming that all battles and losses are the same? Yes?
Sure, yeah, I guess.
I mean, so if you have a particularly kind of like egregious loss or victory, there's kind of like, that's presumed to have the same type of effect, and I kind of wonder about that in the sense that if you had and the second point is concerning sequences, right? So you might have had a loss, then you had a win, then you had a loss. How is that weighted against win, loss, win, right? That's like, you can imagine these sequential issues. So if they're not sequential or not cumulative, and all battles and losses are the same, it would be nice to know that, as well as think of alternative specifications that might consider the implications of that assumption. Michelle.
So my one finger became a two-finger, and building off your request for explicits, I think I have some explicits here, because our conversation, you keep coming back, and some of the other commenters keep coming back and trying to think of, well, what case might fit this? Can I give you an example of what might illustrate whatever it is, the mechanism that we happen to be talking about at that moment? And so one of the very first, and I think easiest, I would hope, you could put in an appendix online or at the end if you have room. I'd like to see a table on the cases in your sample. I don't remember seeing what the sample size was, but I could have missed that. I don't know if it's too large, if such a table would be possible, but I think having that noted at the very beginning of the paper will help the reader for their own mind to pull from whatever their empirical reference point is to start to think about examples. And the other place where I think that same kind of work can be done is in your theory section. I might like to see, I don't know if it would fit in a 2x2. I was trying to draw it out, and my several iterations weren't working, so I don't know if it would fit in a 2x2 or maybe two 2x2s. I'm not sure how you could collapse that. But I would really like to see some kind of typological table that shows what the different options are for if you're responsible for war or not, if your performance in war is good or bad, or however that gets broken down, and then what that means for the incentive, or for the likelihood of internal versus external punishment. And then coupling that with a separate, or if you could collapse it, I'm not sure, table that then looks at scenarios with high or low probability of internal versus external punishment, and what that means for the probability of these different war outcomes. And I think if it fits, again, if you have that sort of abstractly set up first, and then if you can pull out one or two scenarios with just, I mean, you could do it in like 2 or 3 sentences. Right. Here's an illustrative case of what that would actually look like. I think it just helps the reader follow your train of thought a little bit more, and maybe shuts down some of the questions that on clarity.
Okay, I think that's a great suggestion. So in the dissertation version, I had 2 figures. So rather than tables, it was sort of it graphed first the probability of punishment for culpable versus non-culpable leaders over war performance, and then the second figure graphed the likelihood of termination for the same culpable versus non-culpable. So it sort of, I think, did what you're asking for. It might be even sort of simpler to do it in tables rather than figures. Again, that got cut. Sort of the process of taking, you know, a few hundred-word dissertation and putting it into a paper turned out to be more difficult than I anticipated. So. But I can try and fit something like that back in. And I do intend, I don't have the appendix with the list of cases in there now, but do intend to do that once I get to it. I think the sample there are 120 conflict dyads. The number of leaders is, I think, 479. That includes state and rebel leaders. So, but I can. So that would be an appendix in an online supplement, I guess.
Alex on the 2-finger.
Alex, you're muted.
Yes.
Thank you. Sorry about that. So I was going to follow on some of what Christian was saying and my understanding of his comments. For me, in this, like the big sort of bugaboo that hasn't been talked about a whole lot is the endogeneity thing. So I was very glad that you addressed that straight up. But I would have liked to see a little more on exactly how you went after it, because it's something that's very hard for me to convince myself of a story where leaders are punished for screwing up wars sort of after the war is over, but they're not really punished for screwing it up while it's still going on. I mean, it's like, I think you can tell me stories of cases where, you know, the culpable leader dies, and that's sort of exogenous. But I have to imagine at least some of the cases that are in here, you have culpable leaders who are screwing things up and are replaced by non-culpable leaders, and the recognition that the group's not going to achieve the goals that it had set up front. And this guy is somebody who's going to be a more plausible negotiating partner for the other side. So for me, I wanted to see a little bit more about that end of things. And I'll also just say, for me, you know, one of the red flags here, I can believe that there's an effect here. The effect sizes you were getting were actually, from my perspective, really large. And some of that, to me, made me think like there might be some endogeneity going on here. I don't know exactly how best to deal with that. I'm still prepared to believe that the things that you're talking about do matter some, but relatively speaking, I guess what this would be in terms of a specific suggestion is I'd like to see a little bit more in the paper about the endogeneity analysis.
Okay. Yeah, I wasn't sure what to do. So, I mean, it's an issue that I tried to address as best, you know, it's hard to sort of come up with instruments and that kind of thing. So what I did was looked at sort of how is the war going at any given time, and does that predict a leader change to a non-culpable leader? So sort of addressing the issue of is a non-culpable or a non-responsible leader coming to power endogenous to sort of war performance. And so I used the data from UCDP with their sort of monthly battle death geocoded data. I didn't use the geocodings, but and looked at sort of what is the relationship between like level of deaths now versus over the past 12 months. Is it more or less, as sort of the way to get at how the war is going? I know that's not it's not ideal. It's the best I could think of.
I mean, to me, it's in many ways better than what Sarah Croco was able to do because you have better data available.
Right.
I just want to see a little bit more about the detail there. And can you tell me you ran this a bunch of different ways? I'd like to know. It's one thing if this variable is insignificant, but sort of positive and close to significance, another if it's functionally zero, which I would and it's not that the former case would be a huge red flag for me, but I think it's good to address this. There has to be at least some of this going on, and we can point to cases where leaders are removed because they're screwing up the war effort, and that's part of your argument at some level, and so I don't think it's a huge deal, but I want to get a sense of what's going on in the data there.
I agree, and I can talk about it more. I can in the paper itself. But what I do want to say though is that I don't think that it's as big a problem because the issue is not whether leader change itself is endogenous, but it's whether it's leader change and the new leader is culpable or non-culpable. And so I think it's that sort of additional piece of it that makes it less concerning to me. And sort of looking through the data, there are a lot of instances where even when a leader is performing poorly and is removed, the replacement leader is also culpable. And so I think because of that sort of wrinkle to it, I don't think it's as huge of a concern as it would be if I were.
Just to follow up one last thing, and then I'll sort of stop Mayans. My remaining concern here would be if you bifurcate the cases into a set of cases where leader, we don't want to make concessions as a group. Leader is screwing up the war. We're going to kick him out. That would be places where you bring a new culpable leader in. If you're saying this war is going poorly, we need to reach out to the other side. This leader has totally burned all bridges. That would be the case where you would bring in the non-culpable leader, and that again would raise some of the that would certainly push in the direction of the theoretical argument.
Okay. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I can think about how to address that better.
A quick two, and then to Ideen. Mine was concerning at one point reintroducing back the geospatial component, given the fact that how the war is fought will also kind of influence this issue of accountability. I mean, like, if the fighting is highly diffuse, then you could argue that identifying a single leader as being culpable might be more problematic than the one where it's much more centralized or concentrated in a particular location. So thinking about that. Ideen?
Yeah, so this is a one finger, so this is kind of a new topic. I want to reiterate before I do that on a two finger that all of the data need to be validated, checked, quality controlled. So I'm sure you're going to do that in a separate article. But that aside, so this paper kind of reminded me of Albert Hirschman's work. So when an organization declines, you have a choice between exit, voice, and loyalty. And here you're really talking about voice. So I don't like how the organization is going. We're facing defeats on the battlefield, so I'm going to remove the leader. But there's a growing body of literature looking at sort of the internal dynamics of rebel groups, looking at side switching, defections, splintering, things of that sort. So, I could, in response to poor performance, leave and join my own rebel group. I can leave altogether and perhaps, join the government. Or I can even just stay loyal. So, how bad does it have to get before I want to take any of those two options? And there are empirically examples of governments that have offered amnesty deals to rank and file soldiers. Colombia did this, and actually got a lot of rebels to peel away from the organization rather than punish the leader. And that kind of discussion of defection or leaving the organization, the exit option, is not really discussed here. And I was wondering if that's part of the larger dissertation project, if there's something you could say about the choice between deposing the leader, staying loyal to the leader, versus leaving the organization and perhaps going on your own or defecting to the other side. Is there an element of that in the broader project?
So what I actually did with the measure of punishment is I included factionalization. And so I tried to capture cases where maybe the leader wasn't actually removed, but where sort of a big chunk of the organization broke off and formed its own organization, and I counted that as punishment. I've done it a few different ways. So I've done some things where I excluded that and where I've included it back in. So I did try to account for that possibility where punishment doesn't look like what we think of sort of on the state side. That's sort of the extent as of right now of how I've addressed that exit option. But I did try to do that in that way at least.
Jessica.
Okay. So I have a question about the timing of the war initiation and how you think about that. I'm wondering how you think about the start of a conflict, because you're arguing that that first leaders are held responsible for the conflict. But in lots of civil wars, the conflict kind of simmers at a low level before it kind of escalates into what we would consider to be a civil war. So I'm wondering if it's really that the leader, if you have a case where the leader in power when it finally escalates to a civil war is different than the leader when it was kind of simmering at a low level for some number of years. Would you think that case, that those leaders would be held responsible in the same way as we talk about in the paper, or would there be a difference there kind of depending on how the conflict was initiated or what it looked like kind of when it broke out?
Yeah, that was an issue that came up as I was trying to sort of code all of these cases. So there aren't actually I didn't come across too many, thankfully, where the leader...
Okay, Jess, could you read the question?
Okay, yep.
Sorry.
So I didn't come across too many where there were different leaders in power once it crossed the 25 battle death threshold than when there were sort of the first mentions of the conflict. There were a handful. I'm trying to think. I don't know. I can't remember the exact number off the top of my head. What I did was I went with the first leaders. I coded the first leaders at the start of the conflict when it differed, and so I identified those leaders as sort of the first leaders before that 25 battle death threshold was hit. What I can do, and because I've identified those leaders, I can pretty easily compare, or I could do some sort of robustness check where I sort of look at whether that having those leaders in there as first leaders or culpable leaders matters for the results. I haven't addressed it theoretically, so I can certainly do that as well. I think I'm trying to think if there are any cases where there's a different leader in power when there's like the first initiation versus the 25 battle deaths, but that one is culpable and one is not. I can't. I don't know off the top of my head, so I'd have to see if that happens at all in the data.
Cool. I have one. So what's interesting for me is so we're seeing some interesting developments in the literature, right? So first we were kind of structural characteristics, and then we get to organizations, and I like the fact that you're bringing us down to now consider leaders. I'm wondering about some kind of like nesting, right? So leaders are nested within organizations. Organizations are nested in dyads. Dyads are nested in nations. Now this just leads to a different way of modeling it, and so it's kind of a frustration with the kind of articles or slices and books or pies kind of analysis, right? So so we're supposed to allow your slice and not consider the pie in many respects. And so I wonder about the nesting, right? I wonder about the types of organizations. I wonder about how that's factored. And this is like I think a broader question of sorts. But the part that's missed and not mentioned is the role of civilians, the role of citizens. And so the way that the repression and dissent or insurgency, counterinsurgency dynamics play out, other literature tells us has an effect on civilians, which has invariable effects on how the war is fought. We don't get there, but you say accountability to me. That's probably the first accountability I think of in terms of perceptions of order and so forth. But the internal organizational conception that you have and that are pushing, I think that's there. And it's not to say that you necessarily need to address this broader conceptualization of accountability, but I guess articles as slices versus books as pies things really kind of got me thinking. I was like, civilians aren't mentioned at all, and there's that whole other literature that's out there that talks about citizens carrying the balance for which way the thing goes, and we're kind of just supposed to kind of black box that. I started thinking of the state dissident interaction that kind of really got the IRA a lot of assistance in getting started was like Bloody Sunday, right? So there, a state dissident interaction had implications for the citizenry, and then subsequently how the whole thing got fought. And then basically the battle of explaining Bloody Sunday then became, the Widgery report was this 5,000-page document that revisited the whole thing to basically gut that legitimation. So I don't know to what extent it's a smaller comment, but I had that concern on specifically the accountability issue. Like I thought of Neil Mitchell's piece, "Democracy's Blameless Leaders," Bing Powell's piece, "Elections as Instruments of Democracy," and Jonathan Fox's broader piece on accountability. Not the one that writes about religion. I think there's another one out there. And the accountability stuff I saw is I keep referencing the word instead of punishment, but it's like I think they're overlapping, but you have a reason to run with your punishment thing because that's going to speak to a particular audience, and accountability I think broadens it in ways that you don't necessarily wish to do, but I think is brought up. And so if you're good about reviewer selectivity, then your narrowing will help. I don't think that helps us get to some of the bigger nesting things that I kind of wanted to push you on a little bit to kind of think about that. But that might be beyond this piece because the articles get by in part because it ignores the rest of the pie, and I just think that that's hurting the discipline more than anything else. So I just wanted to slide that in there.
Okay. So I think I haven't thought too much about well, no, I have thought about this nesting issue a bit. In particular, I've thought about how the sort of structure of the organization will impact the dynamics that I'm talking about. So that's as far as I've gone. I haven't thought so I've thought to the organizational level. I don't know that I've really fully considered sort of the levels beyond that. I haven't tested anything along those lines yet, so I can't say what the sort of effects will be. But I have thought about sort of looking at, as I think it's come up a few times already in the discussion, sort of these organizations are structured totally differently. Some are really hierarchical. Some are very diffuse. I think that the likelihood of being able to punish or hold accountable a leader will depend in part upon that. At least for internal punishment, maybe not so much with punishment by an adversary. So I have thought a little bit about that. I actually, in my dissertation, I had a small sort of so I had an appendix in there where I essentially tried to code sort of, are the organizations personalist, and so to sort of address that issue of, if it's a strongly hierarchical organization, do we still see the same punishment dynamics? And it did sort of, I can't remember exactly what the results were, but it did condition the relationship a little bit. The problem with that is, you know, as with a lot of the data collection, it's hard to get really good information on that for, in particular, some of the smaller rebel groups where there's just not a ton of information available. So, so that's an issue. But I have started thinking along those lines.
Yeah, I mean, you slide into kind of Idine's comment again, right, which suggests that the data piece would be nice to see.
Yeah.
But then that kind of dynamic of individuals and, I mean, how the organization is structured has all the implications of how the elite-to-elite accountability dynamics would play out, but also how the principal-to-agent dynamics would play out.
Right.
And I'd argue, in many respects, how that organization is structured then has implications for kind of how people are engaging in the violent activity that they are, how the citizenry might respond to it, and then we have this co-evolution, right, that was probably taking place between these dueling institutions. If one institution gets much more violent and selective and is relying upon a small cohort, then the other side is likely going to kind of co-evolve in that direction as well. And I think that it releases some interesting dynamics. Michelle had a two-finger.
Yeah, on this point directly, I think Christian's point about pie versus, you know, the whole pie versus the slice of pie is a good point, but I also think it's really challenging for a single scholar to address that. So my suggestion might be, and I don't know, this might be a more long-term suggestion, you know, next project, but I don't know how familiar you are with Amelia Hoover Green's work, but she's working on some data collection at the armed group level that looks at institutional organizations, their structures, their training practices, their education, and there might be some avenue for collaboration there.
Yeah.
And I think collaboration, honestly, is one of the very few ways that we can address this slice of the pie versus whole pie, particularly when you're pre-tenure. So I might just suggest reaching out to her. I don't know. I know the scope of the project is like 1980 to I think actually 2013. It is at the armed group level. I know several of the variables, like I mentioned, training and recruitment and institutional structure, particularly because, as Christian was mentioning, I think one of her goals is to look at principal agent dynamics and how that affects, but in the flip way of how you're conceptualizing it, and how that affects group behavior in terms of the violence they commit against civilians. I don't know what the stage is of that effort, but I would just encourage you to reach out to her and see if there might be some strategic collaboration that could happen.
Well, I didn't hear the name that you said.
Amelia Hoover Green. She's at Drexel.
Okay.
She's also part of the consortium, so we can definitely facilitate that contact.
Okay.
Will.
So I liked very much the way that you set up and pitch very strongly and clearly what's the contribution and walk us through the beginning of the paper. But I do think there may be an opportunity for improvement. If you, right, so the way you set the question is what explains variation in civil war duration and outcomes, and you identify various concepts that have been shown to have an impact, right? Processes or mechanisms that impact these. But you don't actually talk to us at all about what debates, if any, you think presently exist. So there's an absence of foil, and I think I encourage you to think a little bit about whether there is a foil that you can develop, because I think if you could, that might make it even stronger. Another way that to put this is, does your contribution provide us another thing to consider in our list of usual suspects, or is your contribution that, you know, prior to this work we used to have the following debate, and now we can see that one side of that debate is superior to the other. So I'd encourage you to think about that a little bit. On page 2, you write that, let's see, existing explanations cannot explain why some state and rebel leaders continue to fight despite little hope of winning. But that despite little hope of winning is an unsupported assertion. And later we don't actually gain any information on that. And so if you could provide us, that would help sharpen that. And then on page 6, you make your pitch, and this is the final paragraph there. These existing explanations provide that sentence. You make your pitch there based on a unit of observation or level, leaders that have been missed, rather than a question that has been unaddressed. And so I think there what I wanted to see you do was tie it back to the questions you had asked, right? The what explains variation, and why, and even better, why is it that some leaders continue fighting when it doesn't make sense? I think you have an answer to that question, but what you want to do right there is not say, hey, existing explanations have ignored something we should be paying attention to, but make the case that you asserted earlier, that existing explanations can't tell us what, don't have a satisfactory answer to that question. And then to, in other words, show us that existing theories cannot answer your question, right? And then just to push you a little bit, it's not that obvious to me that a commitment problem approach can't answer your question. That the reason that perhaps we see Savimbi fight, or others like him, is not so much that he knows he can't win and wouldn't be able to get a good deal, a better deal than he's putting himself at risk to, but simply that he just cannot trust the other side. He absolutely won't trust it. They're going to drive him into the ground, and there's nothing credible that ever happens to say different. And so I think that strikes me as a major well, I don't want to say major opportunity. That strikes me as the first time through I didn't really catch it, but the second time, as I went back through trying to organize my thoughts, that's what stood out at me as, if I'm a referee, I'm going to want to push you right there. That's the point where I'm going to say, all right, I don't know that I buy that this commitment problem approach can't give me a very satisfying and interesting answer to the question that you feel like your approach illuminates. So I encourage you to give that some thought.
Okay. You actually, hit on something that I had trouble with in writing it, sort of sorting out, or the framing. Yeah, it's just been, it was difficult to figure out, and so I take those points. I think with the commitment problem thing, that's been a little troubling to me as well, because I agree with you that the commitment problem argument does provide an answer to that, and I've tried to figure out how my argument fits into the commitment problem argument, because I think they're very closely related, and I don't know whether the best way to sort of approach that is to say that, which I think I tried to do, was to say that that looking at the leaders provides some an explanation for variation in either the prevalence or the severity of commitment problems, where a leader who is responsible for the conflict will face more severe commitment problems because of this punishment issue or accountability issue. And that's where I tried to go. I don't know if that's totally convincing to people.
Let me see if I understand the argument. Here's what I think I hear you saying. You're saying that so there's a state or rebel leader who has initiated this conflict, and they've got an opportunity to make some sort of a deal that would is Pareto optimal for the society, and even Pareto optimal for their own coalition, right? but it's suboptimal for them because they, in signing that agreement, are going to have to recognize that they did not achieve what they set out to achieve, and as a consequence, they can expect punishment from either inside or outside. And as a consequence, so the if you think about the from using treatment language, right? That the treatment is there's two different types of leaders. There's the one who started it, and there's the one who can say, "Hey, I didn't get us in this mess. I'm the one who's getting us out." Right? Going back to Nixon's the Nixon Johnson thing, right? Nixon's attempt to sell his approach, and yet the initiator leader doesn't have that. The culpable leader doesn't have that luxury, and so that person is going to leave bargains on the table, but that's ceteris paribus, right? I mean, that's holding constant whether or not that bargain was credible, whether the opponent on the other side was credible. And I guess maybe that's the issue for me.
Okay.
I'm thinking in real time, and I just walked myself into, I'm going to close my mouth now.
Ideen, edit two fingers.
Yeah, it's just about the framing, and it's a really minor point. I wasn't in love with the Savimbi example.
Okay.
They're fighting, and he dies on the battlefield. I'm not sure if that's called punishment or he just died on the battlefield. And then all of a sudden there's a peace agreement. So to me, the obvious example was, well, Savimbi was the obstacle. And is that because of fear of punishment or because Savimbi, he was extreme, he was bleeding the country for its conflict diamonds? There were all kinds of reasons why Savimbi wanted to keep the war going, that may or may not have to do with his probability of punishment. So, maybe another example where perhaps there is a credible fear that if I just turn in my guns and sign an agreement, then I'm going to face some sort of prosecution or something like that. I think a lot of people will say, well, Savimbi, he was just an asshole. And that's not a theory, right? But I think the initial reaction, or my initial gut reaction was, well, this guy was just an extremist who was pillaging his country. So, obviously if you just got rid of him and you decapitated the leader, then you got rid of the obstacle. So maybe some leader that doesn't have that same sort of notorious reputation would be a better way to frame it.
Okay. Michelle.
Yeah, I think so. My one's become a two again here, and I think this might be really new and taking you in a direction you don't necessarily want to go. But as the conversation is unfolding, it seems to me the elephant in the room that's not being addressed is you're talking about leaders, and you're talking about leaders and what affects their decisions, but you're also not addressing that literature. There is a big literature, and particularly I think Megan mentioned in the very beginning she could see this in an I.O. venue, if I'm not mistaken, and I can too. But if it does go to that kind of venue, I think you have to address the leadership literature and leadership styles. And I think that some of that, the asshole effect that that was just mentioned, but other leadership style variables matter as well. How confident am I that I can change the status quo? How much trust do I have of others? How much desire do I have for power versus and influence or things like that? How confrontational am I to the constraints that I might face or whatever? I mean, a lot of these sorts of ideas have been spelled out in the IO literature as it relates to, I don't know this literature very well, so I'm speaking out of turn here, but that relates, I think I've seen it with relation to the UN or other international organizations. I think I've seen it with relation to some of the foreign policy decision-making literature. So if we really are going to theorize leaders' decisions and what structures those, leadership style might matter.
Okay.
I started thinking prospect theory, but I wasn't trying to take us there. Jessica?
Yeah, that could take you in a whole different direction you don't want to go, and I recognize that.
Okay.
Unmute, Jess.
Okay. I'm going to apologize in advance. I'm going to have to step out in a few minutes too. But I have one other, this is kind of a minor question, but it's about whether, this goes back to, I think if I'm understanding your data correctly, that you include both the lower level conflicts from the Uppsala data set, like the 25, at least reaching 25 battle-related deaths, and then the more severe conflicts. And I was wondering whether the public might treat leaders differently depending on the intensity of the conflict. And maybe that's something that you control for that I just missed. But I'm wondering if you saw any kind of bifurcation between those lower level conflicts and the higher level conflicts.
I do include both. I haven't sort of looked to see if there's a big difference between the two, but that might be, I think that might tie into some of the other points that were brought up earlier regarding sort of other factors that may influence the leader's perceived level of responsibility. So that's something that I can certainly look at.
I'll take a chair's prerogative and just toss something out for a second. Ignore it as you see fit, but I'm kind of caught on use of the phrase Civil War, and I'm still wondering about why we're still handling on to this, right? So we have a literature that came out that suggests that we couldn't predict any cases at all. And so I'm like, okay, so if we dismiss those 100 or so pieces that were out there that we can't predict any cases, I'm kind of like, and then Sambanis' evolution to what is Civil War to there is no Civil War, I'm just kind of like, and then on this point, following up on Jess's point as well, it's like, if we have variation across the range of armed conflicts, what does that mean in many respects for kind of like how the argument plays out, and if it plays out at the higher end but not the lower end, or the middle? I mean, just like leaving that as an empirical question. It was just the use throughout the piece of the word war outcomes as opposed to armed conflict, and more consistently kind of like settling on a particular phrase. But that sends signals to reviewers and so forth. So I tossed that out as a way of kind of thinking about kind of like language and so forth. But and some ring went off. Was that anybody's?
Sorry, that was my
okay.
email.
You only gave us a certain amount of time. That's
No, I just happened to get an email right when we're supposed to be ending.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. I think I used the phrases like conflict and civil war sort of interchangeably, just for variety's sake, but. I'm well aware of your sort of your position on the use of.
I got that, but on page 30, right? You got leader, wartime tenure. You have war outcomes. It's very clear where where you butter your bread. I'm just saying, just once, one of these pieces is going to come to somebody like me who's going to be like, you know what? I don't think this category exists any longer, and we need to justify it a little bit stronger. And once that starts to happen, then we change the debate. Right now, everybody can hang out in their slice, and we ignore the pie. That's generally what happens. We hang out with our slice, we ignore the pie. So.
Point taken.
Yeah. Okay.
Metaphor of the day.
Years too. Okay. That's good. But all good. Everyone, thank you very much for joining the session. This was fabulous. What we've been trying to do after these things is, if you use some form of social media or whatever, please send us a shout, send comments our way about how it is you think we could improve this, or suggestions to people. And if you don't mind, 2 to 3 other individuals that you think might benefit from it, please send emails to them as well about, hey, this might be a venue you might want to think about in the future. Will?
Yeah, we had a total of 6. In fact, Alyssa was one of the good people who I pestered and got a proposal out of her. We'll be doing it again in the fall, and we hope to have many more than 6. We'll probably have 7 or 8 slots available for the fall. We'll do the call probably sometime in August. If you did not know, this was recorded. We've been live on YouTube. You'll be able to go back and watch this again or not. I'll be sending a link to you. Please, if you haven't filled out the little form and formally joined Conflict Consortium, visit our site and do that. But most importantly, thank you, as Christian thanked you for for being willing to jump in and participate in this forum. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, Alyssa.
Thank you for the comments. I appreciate it.
All right, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.